The fog clung to the ancient oaks like a shroud, whispering secrets through the twisted branches that guarded Monticello's forgotten edges. In the dim glow of a waning moon, the great house stood silent, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the abyss. Thomas Jefferson, architect of nations and keeper of unspoken desires, paced the creaking floors of his study, the weight of his quill forgotten amid the storm brewing in his soul. His wife, Martha, had always been the fragile light in his world of ambition, a woman whose laughter once echoed through these halls like a melody from a distant dream. But now, that light flickered, threatened by shadows he himself had cast. It began with the subtle shifts, a glance too long, a whisper too soft in the quarters where Sally Hemings moved like a ghost among the enslaved. Sally, with her eyes that held the fire of forbidden knowledge, carried a secret that grew within her, a life intertwined with Jefferson's own blood. Martha had sensed it first in the air, a scent of jasmine mingled with deceit, drifting from the hidden paths where lovers met under the cover of night. She had found the evidence one fateful evening, tucked away in a drawer like a venomous serpent, a lock of dark hair, a note scrawled in haste, words that burned her heart to ash. As the nights grew longer, the woods beyond the estate seemed to awaken. Faint voices slithered through the underbrush, murmurs that no wind could carry, calling names long buried in regret. Martha wandered the gardens at twilight, her steps unsteady, drawn by an invisible thread toward the tree line where the darkness thickened like blood. The air grew heavy with unspoken accusations, and in the quiet hours before dawn, she felt eyes upon her, eyes that knew the truth of her husband's divided affections. What force lurked there, hidden in the roots and thorns, waiting to claim what jealousy had sown? The mystery deepened with each rustle of leaves, each echo that hinted at vanishings without trace, pulling her inexorably into the void. In the opulent yet shadowed halls of Monticello, where candlelight flickered against walls lined with books and dreams of liberty, Martha Jefferson had always moved with a quiet grace that belied the fragility of her health. Her days were spent tending to the gardens or playing the harpsichord, her delicate fingers drawing melodies that soothed the ambitions of her husband, Thomas. But on this particular autumn evening in 1789, as the first chill of approaching winter seeped through the cracks of the great house, something drew her to his private study unannounced. Thomas was away in Paris, serving as minister to France, leaving behind a household humming with the rhythms of enslaved labor and unspoken hierarchies. Martha, restless and plagued by headaches that had worsened since her last childbirth, sought solace among his papers. She told herself it was merely to feel closer to him, to touch the words he had penned in his absence. The drawer to his desk yielded easily under her hand, as if it had been waiting for this moment. At first, the contents seemed innocuous, drafts of letters to foreign dignitaries, sketches of architectural wonders, notes on agricultural experiments. But deeper, beneath a stack of correspondence tied with ribbon, lay a small bundle wrapped in plain cloth. Her heart quickened inexplicably as she unwrapped it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded with care, and a lock of dark, silken hair that caught the lamplight like midnight water. The letter was not addressed to her. The handwriting was Thomas's, elegant, precise, unmistakable. The words began innocently enough, speaking of the beauty of Parisian nights and the longing for home. But as Martha's eyes traveled down the page, the tone shifted into something intimate, tender, possessive. Phrases leaped out like accusations. Your eyes hold me captive, the warmth of your skin lingers in my dreams, our secret hours sustain me. And then, most damning of all, a name signed not with formality but with aching familiarity, Sally. Sally Hemings. The young enslaved woman who had accompanied Thomas's daughter to France and returned with them, her beauty quietly noted by visitors to Monticello. Martha had seen the way her husband's gaze sometimes lingered, had dismissed it as the idle appreciation of a man surrounded by beauty in his home. But now, holding this evidence in trembling hands, the truth crashed over her like a wave of ice water. The lock of hair belonged to Sally. Martha knew it instinctively. The texture, the deep ebony sheen, the faint scent of jasmine that clung to it. This was no mere correspondence between master and servant. This was the proof of a betrayal that cut deeper than any political intrigue or financial worry. Her husband, the man who wrote of equality and human rights, who had penned the words that would echo through history, had taken comfort in the body of a woman he owned. Martha sank into the chair by the window, the letter crumpling in her fist as silent tears traced paths down her pale cheeks. Outside, the Virginia hills rolled away into gathering darkness, and somewhere in the quarters beyond the gardens, Sally moved about her duties, perhaps unaware that the fragile balance of their world had just shattered forever. The discovery burned in Martha's chest, a poison spreading slowly, awakening doubts and furies she had never known she possessed. In that moment, alone with the ghosts of her husband's desires, the first threads of a deeper darkness began to weave themselves into the fabric of Monticello. The days following the discovery dragged like shadows across Monticello's polished floors, each one heavier than the last. Martha Jefferson, her body already weakened by years of difficult pregnancies and lingering ailments, found sleep elusive. The letter and lock of hair remained hidden in her drawer, but their presence haunted her every waking moment, a silent accusation that gnawed at the edges of her composure. She moved through the house like a spectre, her smiles forced for the sake of her daughters, her hands trembling as she poured tea or embroidered in the parlor. It was in the quiet hours of early morning, when the estate stirred with the first activities of the enslaved workers, that the whispers reached her ears. From the kitchens and laundry yards drifted fragments of conversation, soft voices carrying on the crisp air, meant to be private but impossible to ignore in the close quarters of plantation life. Martha had taken to walking the gardens at dawn, seeking fresh air to ease her persistent headaches, wrapping herself in a shawl against the autumn chill. On one such morning, as mist rose from the Mulberry Row cabins, she paused near the fence line, drawn by the low murmur of women at their tasks. There, among the group tending the wash, was Critter Hemings, Sally's older sister, speaking in hushed tones to another housemaid. The words were indistinct at first, carried away by the breeze, but Martha edged closer, concealing herself behind a hedge of boxwood. "Swelling already, poor thing," Critter said, her voice laced with sympathy. "Can't hide it much longer, not with the way she's been sick in the mornings." The other woman nodded, glancing around cautiously. "Master's child, no doubt about it. Been meeting in the evenings, down by the old cabin when he thinks no one's watching." Martha's breath caught in her throat, the world narrowing to those few damning phrases. Sally, pregnant. The young woman whose beauty had always been quietly remarked upon, whose duties brought her into the main house more often than others. The signs had been there, subtle but accumulating: Sally's pallor at breakfast, her excuses to retire early, the way she now favored looser aprons over her seams. But hearing it confirmed, spoken plainly among those who lived the truths of the quarters, turned suspicion into irrevocable certainty. The betrayal deepened, twisting like a knife in Martha's fragile heart. Not only had Thomas entangled himself with the enslaved girl who bore an uncanny resemblance to her own younger self half-sister through their shared father, a fact that added layers of grotesque intimacy, but now this union bore fruit. A child, growing within Sally, proof that the stolen moments were not fleeting passion but something sustained, deliberate. Martha pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the rapid flutter of her pulse, the familiar ache that signaled another spell of weakness approaching. Retreating to the house, she avoided the eyes of the servants, sensing their knowing glances, the unspoken hierarchy that protected such secrets among themselves. The estate's rhythms continued unchanged, the clatter of pots, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer, but for Martha, everything had shifted into sharper, crueler focus. The pregnancy meant permanence, a living tie that would bind Thomas to Sally long after whatever fleeting desire waned. Jealousy mingled with despair, fueling a quiet rage that simmered beneath her ladle-like restraint. Whispers from the quarters had pierced the veil, confirming what the letter had only hinted at, and in that confirmation, the fragile threads holding Martha's world together began to fray irreparably. The air grew thicker with unspoken tensions, the great house no longer a sanctuary but a prison of secrets, where every footstep echoed with the weight of impending revelation. The return of Thomas Jefferson from Paris in late 1789 brought a deceptive calm to Monticello, the great house alive once more with the master's voice echoing through its corridors. He arrived weary from the voyage yet energized by revolutionary fervor, his trunks filled with books, seeds, and ideas that would shape a young nation. To the outside world, the reunion with Martha was tender, his arms enveloping her slight frame, his lips brushing her forehead as he murmured endearments long withheld by distance. But beneath the surface, a chasm had opened, one that Martha alone perceived with agonizing clarity. For weeks she had carried the secret like a splinter driven deep, the letter and lock of hair locked away yet burning in her memory. She watched him now with new eyes, noting how his gaze sought out Sally in the dining room or gardens, how conversations paused when the young woman entered bearing trays or linens. The pregnancy, though not yet visible to casual observers, had become unmistakable to Martha, the subtle curve beneath Sally's apron, the protective way she sometimes rested a hand low on her abdomen when she thought no one noticed. The confrontation came on a night when storm clouds gathered over the Blue Ridge, thunder rumbling like distant artillery. Jefferson had retired late to his cabinet, poring over correspondence by candlelight, when Martha appeared in the doorway unannounced. She wore only her nightgown and robe, her hair unbound, face pale as parchment in the flickering glow. In her hand she clutched the crumpled letter, its edges worn from countless secret readings. Thomas looked up, surprise softening into concern at her disheveled state. "My dear, you should be abed. The hour is late and the air damp." But Martha did not move. She crossed the room slowly, each step deliberate, until she stood before his desk. Without a word she placed the letter upon his papers, the lock of hair tumbling from its folds like an accusation made flesh. The silence stretched, broken only by rain beginning to lash the windows. Jefferson's expression shifted recognition, then something darker, a mixture of guilt and defiance. He reached for the letter but did not open it, as if touching it would make the moment more real. "Martha," he began, voice low, "this is not what you believe." Her laugh was brittle, sharp as breaking glass. "Not what I believe. Your words are plain, Thomas. Your tenderness, your longing all poured out for her. And now she carries your child." The words hung between them, raw and irreversible. Jefferson rose slowly, hands spread in supplication, but Martha stepped back, her eyes blazing with a fury he had never seen. "You speak of liberty," she whispered, voice trembling yet gaining strength, "of the rights of man, yet you keep a girl in chains and make her your whore. My own half-sister's daughter, did that make it easier? Did her face remind you of what you could no longer have in me?" The accusation struck deep, touching wounds of grief and desire neither had ever voiced. Martha's health had failed after their last child, physicians warned against further pregnancies, leaving a void Jefferson had filled elsewhere. He moved toward her, pleading now, but she raised a hand to stop him. "Do not touch me. Not with hands that have touched her." Thunder crashed overhead as tears finally spilled down her cheeks, not of weakness but of rage long suppressed. Jefferson's composure cracked. For the first time, the architect of reason stood exposed, his contradictions laid bare in the lamplight. Old resentments surfaced, his absences, his ambitions that always came first, the way he had mourned her declining health yet sought vitality elsewhere. The argument spiraled into the early hours, voices rising and falling with the storm, revelations tumbling forth like stones dislodged from a crumbling wall. Martha spoke of isolation, of watching her world shrink while his expanded. Jefferson defended himself with talk of human frailty, of needs that transcended station or law. Yet beneath his rationalizations lay fear of losing her, fear of the scandal that could destroy everything he had built. When dawn finally paled the sky, both stood exhausted, the space between them vast as an ocean. Martha turned away first, her silhouette framed against the rain-streaked window, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Jefferson reached out once more, his hand hovering in the air before falling uselessly to his side. The storm had passed, leaving only the drip of water from eaves and the heavy knowledge that some betrayals, once spoken aloud, could never be retrieved. In the hush that followed, the house itself seemed to hold its breath, aware that the fracture in their union had widened into something irreparable, a wound from which darker forces might yet emerge. In the weeks following the midnight confrontation, a fragile truce settled over Monticello like frost on the autumn leaves, brittle and cold. Thomas Jefferson immersed himself deeper in his books and experiments, drafting letters to distant correspondents as if words on paper could mend the fractures in his home. Martha withdrew further into her rooms, her health declining with each passing day, plagued by fevers and a persistent cough that echoed through the halls like an unspoken reproach. Sally Hemings, meanwhile, carried on with her duties in the great house, her condition now subtly evident in the way she moved more carefully, her hands often resting protectively over the slight swell beneath her apron. The enslaved quarters along Mulberry Row buzzed with quiet concern for her, the Hemings family closing ranks in subtle ways. Extra portions of food slipped her way, lighter tasks assigned without question. But isolation weighed on Sally as well. She felt the eyes of the White family upon her, Martha's especially, sharp with unspoken accusation whenever their paths crossed in the corridors. Nights found her restless, lying awake in the small cabin she shared with others, listening to the wind rattle the shutters and carry faint sounds from the surrounding forest. It was on one such night, as a thin rain pattered against the roof, that the note appeared. Sally discovered it at dawn, slipped beneath the door of her quarters a single folded scrap of coarse paper, unmarked by seal or ribbon. Her heart quickened as she unfolded it in the dim light, her literacy a quiet gift from years in the house. The words were scrawled in an unfamiliar hand, uneven and hurried. Beware the woods that border this place. Shadows watch and wait for betrayal's fruit. Leave what is not yours, or join those already claimed. No signature, no clue to the sender. Sally's fingers trembled as she read it again, the warning sinking into her like the chill seeping through the cracks in the walls. The woods, those dense, ancient thickets that ringed the estate, where enslaved workers sometimes gathered herbs or escaped briefly into solitude, had always carried an air of foreboding. Whispers among the quarters spoke of strange lights seen there on moonless nights, of voices murmuring in languages long forgotten, of paths that twisted back on themselves to trap the unwary. Who could have written this? Martha, consumed by bitterness? One of the other servants, envious or fearful of the favoritism shown to the Hemings family? Or perhaps an outsider, some itinerant worker harboring resentment toward the master? Sally burned the note in the hearth that morning, watching the flames devour the words, but they lingered in her mind like smoke. She began to avoid the tree line, taking longer routes through the gardens, her steps hurried even in daylight. Yet the warning echoed, amplifying the unease that already permeated the plantation. Strange occurrences followed, branches scraping against windows in windless hours, distant calls that sounded almost like weeping carried on the breeze from the forest depths. Sally confided in no one, not even her brother James, fearing it would only stir more trouble. But in quiet moments, sewing in the attic or tending to the young Jefferson girls, she felt the pull of those woods, as if something ancient and vengeful stirred within them, awakened by the tangled sins of love and power that bound the house. The estate's isolation amplified every rustle, every shadow stretching long at dusk, turning the familiar landscape into a realm of hidden menace where unseen eyes tracked the unfolding drama. The winter of 1789 crept into Monticello like a slow poison, the Blue Ridge cloaked in mist that refused to lift even at midday. Martha Jefferson's world, once bounded by gardens and music rooms, had shrunk to the dim confines of her bedchamber, where heavy curtains kept out the weak light and the heavier truths pressing from without. Her body betrayed her daily now, fevers that rose with the moon, a cough that rattled in her chest like dry leaves, hands that shook when she tried to hold a teacup steady. Physicians came and went, murmuring about consumption and the frailty of her constitution, prescribing laudanum and rest, but no medicine touched the deeper ailment gnawing at her spirit. It began innocently enough, a branch scraping against the windowpane during a windless night, a sound too deliberate to be mere weather. Martha sat upright in bed, heart pounding, certain she had heard footsteps in the corridor outside her door. But when the maid investigated, the hallway stood empty, portraits of ancestors staring down in silent judgment. From that night forward, sleep became a battleground. She would drift into uneasy slumber only to jolt awake, convinced that whispers threaded through the air, soft, feminine voices murmuring words she could almost grasp, names she dared not repeat. By day she wandered the house like a ghost, avoiding the bustle of the lower floors where Sally moved with increasing care, her pregnancy now impossible to conceal beneath flowing aprons. Martha caught glimpses of her in passing, a hand steadying herself on a banister, a quiet laugh shared with another servant, and each sighting fueled the fire within. Jealousy twisted into something darker, a conviction that the girl carried not just a child but a curse, one that seeped into the very walls of the house. The woods beyond the estate, once a distant backdrop to Monticello's ordered beauty, now seemed to pulse with malevolent life. From her window Martha watched the tree line, seeing shapes shift among the trunks that were not quite deer or fox. At twilight the mist rose from the ground like breath from buried lungs, and she swore figures stood just beyond the garden fence, pale, indistinct, watching. The voices grew bolder then, carried on the damp air, fragments of conversation, a woman's cry cut short, her own name spoken in tones of pity and warning. She began to question her senses. Was the shadow in the corner of her room truly a trick of candlelight, or did it linger after the flame was snuffed? When she passed a mirror, did her reflection hesitate a fraction too long before following her movement? The laudanum dulled the pain in her body but sharpened these fancies, turning the great house into a labyrinth of doubt. Servants whispered that the mistress had taken to speaking to empty rooms, asking questions of the air as if expecting answers. Thomas noticed, of course, how could he not, but his attempts at comfort only deepened her isolation. His touch felt tainted now, his concern hollow. In the quiet hours she sat by the fire, staring into the flames until they formed pictures, Sally's face smiling in triumph, her own body wasting away while life bloomed in another's. The conviction took root that the woods held the source of her torment, some ancient force stirred by betrayal, feeding on her grief and waiting for her to weaken further. Every rustle outside, every unexplained creak in the old timbers, became evidence of pursuit by something that knew her secrets and judged her wanting. The boundary between fever dream and waking horror blurred, pulling her deeper into a spiral where sanity frayed thread by thread, and the darkness beyond the windows seemed to press closer with each passing night. Patient and inevitable as the first hints of spring struggled through the lingering Virginia chill in early 1782, Martha Jefferson's strength ebbed like tide retreating from a crumbling shore. The fevers that had plagued her through winter now burned steadily, confining her to bed for days at a time, her once bright eyes dulled by laudanum and exhaustion. Yet on one uncommonly mild afternoon, when sunlight pierced the heavy drapes of her chamber and birdsong drifted faintly from the gardens, a restlessness seized her. The voices that haunted her nights had grown insistent during waking hours, threading through her thoughts like invisible fingers beckoning her outward. She rose unsteadily, dismissing the maid's concerned protests with a frail wave of her hand. Wrapping herself in a heavy shawl despite the mildness, Martha descended the grand staircase slowly, each step a negotiation with her failing body. The house felt unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath, even the usual clatter from the kitchens seemed muffled. Thomas was away overseeing the planting fields, and Sally, now heavy with child, had been relegated to lighter indoor tasks, their paths carefully orchestrated to avoid collision. Martha slipped out through a side door into the gardens, the cool air sharp against her heated skin. She wandered past the neat beds of emerging herbs and early blooms, drawn inexorably toward the western edge where manicured lawns gave way to wilder ground. The tree line loomed there, dark and dense, the ancient oaks and tangled undergrowth forming a wall that separated Monticello's ordered world from whatever lay beyond. Dusk was gathering early beneath gathering clouds, painting the sky in bruised purples and grays. She paused at the fence, fingers curling around the rough wood as a wave of dizziness passed. The voices came then, not imagined whispers from her fevered mind, but clear and close, rising from the woods themselves. Women's voices, layered and overlapping, speaking in tones both sorrowful and urgent. They called her name Martha, soft at first, then with growing insistence, as if pleading for her to come closer. The sound wrapped around her like mist, familiar yet strange, carrying echoes of laughter from long-ago gatherings mingled with cries of loss. Compelled by some force deeper than reason, she unlatched the gate and stepped through, her slippers sinking into the soft earth of the forest floor. The light dimmed immediately beneath the canopy, shadows stretching long and grasping. She moved forward slowly, one hand trailing along tree trunks for support, following a narrow path worn by deer or runaway dreams. The voices grew clearer with each step, weaving through the branches, fragments of lullabies her mother once sang, snatches of conversation from her wedding day, and beneath it all, a current of warning that chilled her despite her fever. Deeper in, the air thickened with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, the temperature dropping sharply as if the woods guarded their own season. Martha's breath came in visible puffs, her legs trembling with effort, yet she pressed on, drawn by the promise of understanding, of finally confronting whatever entity fed on her grief and jealousy. The voices swirled around her now, some gentle, some accusatory, all pulling her toward a small clearing where twilight pooled like ink. There, among the roots of a massive oak, she thought she glimpsed movement, pale shapes shifting just beyond clear sight, forms that might have been women long lost to these grounds, their eyes fixed upon her with knowing pity. Her strength failed at last, knees buckling as she sank against the tree's rough bark. The voices rose in a chorus then, surrounding her completely, no longer calling but enveloping, promising release from pain, from betrayal, from the slow death waiting in her bedchamber. In that moment, overwhelmed by their siren pull and her own exhaustion, Martha felt the boundary between life and whatever waited in the shadows begin to dissolve, the woods claiming her step by tentative step into their eternal embrace. The morning after Martha's disappearance dawned grey and heavy, the mist clinging to Monticello's lawns like a funeral veil. Thomas Jefferson woke to an empty bedchamber, the sheets still bearing the faint imprint of her slight form but cold to the touch. At first he assumed she had risen early for one of her garden walks, yet the house felt unnaturally still, no soft footsteps in the corridors, no faint cough echoing from the upper floors. When the maid entered with breakfast and found the room untouched, panic began to ripple outward like a stone dropped in dark water. Jefferson searched the house methodically at first, her sitting room, the music parlor where her harpsichord sat silent, the library where she sometimes read by the window. Nothing. Her shawl was missing from its peg, her slippers gone from beside the bed. A chill settled in his chest that had nothing to do with the December air. He summoned the overseer and every able-bodied worker from the fields and quarters, his voice steady but edged with something the servants had never heard before, fear. By mid-morning the search moved outdoors. Men fanned out across the gardens, calling her name in measured intervals, their voices swallowed by the fog. Jefferson himself led a smaller group toward the western tree line, the very place where Martha had last been seen lingering the previous evening. The gate stood unlatched, swinging gently on its hinges as if someone had passed through in haste. He stepped beyond the fence into the woods, boots sinking into the damp earth, heart hammering with a dread he could not name. The forest floor yielded immediate signs, a scrap of pale fabric caught on a low thorn bush, torn from the hem of Martha's favorite nightgown. Nearby, footprints, small, delicate, unmistakable, pressed into the soft loam, leading deeper along a narrow deer path. Jefferson followed them, breath visible in the cold, calling her name until his throat grew raw. The tracks meandered, sometimes doubling back as if she had hesitated or become disoriented, then straightened again toward the heart of the woods. Further in, the signs grew stranger. A single white glove lay discarded beside a fallen log, fingers curled as though it had been dropped in sudden fright. A few paces beyond, a small silver locket, Martha's, containing miniatures of their daughters, hung from a branch at eye level, its chain deliberately draped like an offering. No blood, no struggle marks, only these deliberate markers that suggested she had moved deeper willingly, or perhaps compelled by something that left no physical trace. As the light faded toward afternoon, the searchers spread wider, lanterns flickering to life in the gathering gloom. Jefferson pressed on alone for a time, following the faint trail until even the footprints vanished into a thicket of brambles. There, in a small clearing ringed by ancient oaks, he found the final clue, a single page torn from Martha's personal journal, half buried in leaves, its ink smeared by dew. The visible words read only "They call me" in her familiar, trembling hand. He stood motionless, the paper shaking in his grip, while distant voices of the search party echoed through the trees, growing fainter as the woods seemed to swallow every sound. The great house waited behind him, windows dark, servants watching from doorways with wide eyes. Sally Hemings, heavy with child, stood at an upper window, hands pressed to the glass, her face unreadable. Jefferson felt the weight of every secret, every betrayal, pressing down as the forest closed around the last traces of his wife, leaving only silence and the growing certainty that Martha had not simply wandered away, she had been taken by something that had waited patiently for the moment when grief and jealousy opened the door. As the search for Martha stretched into its third fruitless day, a heavy pall settled over Monticello, the great house hushed as if mourning a death already certain. Thomas Jefferson barely slept, his eyes shadowed with grief and guilt, riding out at dawn and returning only when darkness forced the lanterns to fail against the vast woods. The workers whispered among themselves, their tasks performed in silence, fear threading through the quarters that something unnatural had claimed the mistress. Sally Hemings, now in the later months of her pregnancy, moved through her duties with a careful slowness, her body heavy yet her steps light, as though trying to occupy as little space as possible in a house suddenly too full of absence. Nights were the worst for her. Confined to the small cabin she shared with family, Sally lay awake on her narrow bed, one hand resting on the curve of her belly where the child stirred restlessly. Sleep, when it came, brought no relief, only visions that seized her with cold dread. The dreams began the same each time. She stood at the edge of the woods in twilight, mist curling around her ankles like grasping fingers, and there, beneath the ancient oaks, Martha appeared. Not the frail, fever-wasted woman of recent months, but younger, stronger, her face luminous yet terrible with accusation. In the dream, Martha never spoke at first. She only watched, eyes dark with sorrow and something colder, a knowledge beyond the grave. Then she would raise one pale hand, pointing not at Sally but at the child within her, as if marking it for judgment. The woods behind Martha filled with shapes, other women, indistinct yet familiar, their forms shifting like smoke, faces bearing the features of those long lost to the plantation's history. They murmured in voices that blended with the wind, words Sally could almost understand: justice, betrayal, blood for blood. Sometimes Martha stepped closer, her lips moving at last. "He was mine," she would whisper, voice carrying the weight of every unspoken year of their marriage. "You took what little remained." Sally would try to answer, to plead innocence or ignorance, but no sound emerged, only the frantic kick of the unborn child, as though it too sensed the approaching reckoning. On the worst nights, Martha reached out, fingers brushing Sally's cheek with a touch like winter frost, leaving behind a burning cold that lingered even after waking. Sally woke from these visions gasping, sweat cooling on her skin despite the fire in the hearth. She dared not cry out, fearing to wake the others, but she pressed both hands to her belly, whispering apologies to the child, to Martha, to the shadows that seemed to listen from every corner. Guilt coiled within her, not for the love that had grown in secret places, but for the pain it had unleashed, pain that now manifested in these nightly hauntings. The line between dream and waking blurred. She began to dread sleep as much as the empty gaze Thomas turned upon her in passing, or the way the woods seemed to lean closer to the estate each day, branches scraping against rooftops like nails seeking entry. The visions left her drained, dark circles deepening beneath her eyes, yet she confided in no one, not her mother, not her brothers, for fear the telling would make the dreams more real. In the quiet hours before dawn, she sat by the window, watching the tree line where Martha had vanished, half expecting to see that pale figure emerge, beckoning her to follow into the same silence. The child moved again, a reminder of life persisting amid gathering darkness, and Sally wondered if these hauntings were warning or punishment, if the woods held not just Martha's body but her unresting spirit, waiting for the balance of guilt and grief to tip fully into their eternal claim. The search for Martha Jefferson yielded nothing but echoes and exhaustion, the woods guarding their secret with impenetrable silence as winter deepened into 1782. Thomas Jefferson, hollow-eyed and unshaven, retreated to his cabinet, poring over maps of the estate as if geography alone could reveal what human effort had failed to uncover. The great house settled into a mournful routine, servants moving on hushed feet, fires burning low as though the very flames feared to draw attention. In this atmosphere of suspended grief, forgotten corners of Monticello began to yield fragments long buried, papers disturbed by the frantic turning of drawers and chests during the hunt for clues. It was Jefferson's younger daughter, Polly, playing in the attic on a rare day when rain kept her indoors, who first discovered the bundle. Tucked behind a trunk of old linens, wrapped in oilskin to protect against damp, lay a collection of documents yellowed with age, letters, journals, and crude sketches on heavy paper that crumbled at the edges. She carried them downstairs in triumph, unaware of the shadows they would cast. Jefferson took them with trembling hands, dismissing her gently before spreading the contents across his desk by candlelight. The papers traced back generations, to the earliest days when the land was cleared for the plantation. Entries in faded ink spoke of strange occurrences in the woods bordering the property, lights seen on moonless nights, workers vanishing without trace, voices heard calling from the depths. One journal, penned by Jefferson's own grandfather, described a ritual observed among the enslaved in the 1720s, women gathering herbs at twilight, marking trees with symbols that blended African signs with older, indigenous marks, whispering to unseen presences believed to guard the forest from those who violated sacred bonds. More chilling were the letters exchanged between previous mistresses of the house and distant kin, recounting tales of betrayal met with swift retribution. A great-aunt wrote of a wife who, upon discovering her husband's infidelity with an enslaved woman, wandered into those same woods and was never seen again, her spirit said to linger as guardian and avenger. Sketches accompanied the accounts, rough drawings of circles etched into tree trunks, of figures standing in clearings with arms raised toward the sky, faces obscured by hoods or mist. The most recent document, dated only decades before Jefferson's inheritance, detailed a family curse whispered among the older servants, that any master who sowed division through forbidden unions would awaken the wood's ancient wrath, drawing the wronged toward its heart where judgment waited. The language blended Christian warnings of divine retribution with older beliefs in spirits tied to the land, angered by spilled blood and broken oaths. Jefferson read these words with growing unease, recognizing echoes of the cryptic note Sally had burned, the strange markings searchers had glimpsed carved freshly into bark near where Martha's trail ended. As he sat alone into the night, the house creaking around him like an old ship, these unearthed truths wove themselves into the fabric of recent events. The voices Martha claimed to hear, the deliberate placement of her belongings along the path, Sally's haunting dreams all pointed to something older than their personal tragedy, a force that had watched generations of the family and now stirred again, fed by jealousy, guilt, and the unequal power that defined their world. The documents lay scattered across the desk like bones exhumed from shallow graves, revealing that Martha's disappearance was no mere accident of fevered wandering but part of a longer pattern, one that bound the living to the restless dead through threads of forbidden desire and unforgiven wrong. The woods, it seemed, had always been waiting, patient as roots delving deep into Virginia soil, ready to claim what betrayal offered freely at its edge. The first warm days of spring 1782 brought an uneasy thaw to Monticello, the ground softening beneath melting frost while the house remained locked in winter's grip of sorrow. Thomas Jefferson, driven by a compulsion that bordered on madness, returned repeatedly to the woods where Martha's trail had vanished, the unearthed documents clutched in his coat pocket like talismans against the unknown. Sally Hemings, her pregnancy now far advanced, confined herself mostly to the upper floors, her dreams of Martha's accusing spirit growing more vivid with each passing night, the child within her kicking as if in protest against the gathering storm. On a night when thunderheads piled high over the mountains and lightning flickered like veins across the sky, Jefferson ventured deeper into the forest than ever before, lantern in one hand and a worn journal in the other. He followed markings he had only recently learned to recognize, faint carvings on tree trunks, circles intersected by lines that matched the sketches in his grandfather's papers. The path led to the small clearing where Martha's journal page had been found, the massive oak at its center now seeming to pulse with unnatural life in the storm's erratic light. Sally, restless and unable to sleep through the rumbling thunder, had slipped from her bed and followed at a distance, drawn by the same inexplicable pull that had claimed Martha months before. Her steps were slow, one hand supporting her belly, but determination overrode caution. She arrived at the clearing's edge just as Jefferson reached its heart, his lantern casting long shadows that danced like specters among the roots. The air grew thick, charged not just with impending rain but with something heavier, older. From the ground mist rose shapes, pale, translucent forms of women, their faces shifting between recognition and rage. Martha stood foremost among them, no longer frail but radiant with ethereal fury, her eyes fixed upon Jefferson with a mixture of love and condemnation. Behind her gathered others, women from generations past, enslaved and free, mistresses and servants, all bound by threads of betrayal woven through the plantation's history. Jefferson fell to his knees, the lantern dropping to illuminate the circle etched into the earth beneath the oak freshly carved, as if the ground itself had opened to reveal its ancient claim. The spirits closed in, their voices rising in a chorus that blended lamentation with judgment, speaking of oaths broken, lives taken, balances long overdue. Sally stepped forward instinctively, drawn into the circle despite terror gripping her heart, the child within her moving violently as if sensing the confrontation. Martha turned toward her then, expression softening into sorrow as she reached out, not with vengeance but with understanding, fingers brushing the air near Sally's swollen belly. Jefferson cried out, reaching for both women, his rational world crumbling under the weight of forces he had dismissed as superstition. The storm broke overhead, rain lashing down in sheets that blurred the boundary between living and dead, as the entity born of centuries of unspoken pain manifested fully, neither ghost nor demon but the accumulated grief of those wronged by power's careless exercise. In that heart of the woods, beneath lightning that illuminated truths too raw for daylight, the three faced the reckoning together, master, lover, wife, bound by love twisted into tragedy. The voices swelled to a crescendo, demanding acknowledgement, restitution, release. Jefferson's pleas mingled with Sally's silent tears, Martha's ethereal form beginning to fade as the storm's fury peaked, the ancient force drawing them all toward a final, irreversible judgment where secrets could no longer hide and the darkness within each soul stood fully revealed.